Hey everyone, we'll start up. This is not a formal meeting, this is a workshop. I don't have to use my gavel, we don't have to do a pledge. I do know that the chairs that you're sitting in were the subject of a discussion today as to which ones might get replaced. I don't know if the court system spoke to you.
How about all of them?
Did you get that, Jeff Sims?
Yeah, I know, this is really important.
Chair replacement to happen.
So for those who are...
But it's not true, so,
So those looking, the ones with a wooden back belong to the courts.
my gosh.
And the ones with the cushion
It took all of
back
30
belong to the
seconds for this
city.
meeting.
And there's a debate as to like which ones can be replaced and who can replace them. Anyway, I won't belabor the details, but I just thought I'd introduce that. Okay, so we've got a workshop. Ren is absent, and also Dan Amar Blair is absent for good reasons. And we'll start up. Everyone else looks to be here. We have John Clark, we have our city administrator, Chris White, and we have Nick Ward-Willis, our city attorney, and Christian Gates, our city attorney, filling the very big shoes of Drew Gambles. So, welcome. Let's start up. First item is the appointment of Tom Lucchese to the position of fire chief. Chris and the chief, are you going to do this?
I'm going to do this, and then Gary is here as well. Chief Van Voorhis is here in case any questions come up. As we discussed in our executive session last week, we have been searching for a new chief since Chief Van Voorhis retired officially in late 2022. After an exhaustive search, we have determined that our top candidate is Tom Lucchese or Lucchese?
Lucchese.
All right, you threw me for a bit of a loop. I thought
Sorry.
maybe I had pronounced it wrong. In your packet, you have both a copy of Tom's resume and a memo from me. We did have a discussion last week where you were able to ask questions. What we've done is we've asked Tom to come tonight to give a brief introduction of himself, and then we would hope that we could vote him in next week and swear him in so that he can begin the transition. Now, Gary is going to stay with the city for some amount of time to help with the transition and with the firehouse, but he's been more than generous already in the time that he's stayed. And I just, before we start talking about Tom, want to thank Gary for his incredible service over the last 8 years to the city, and for giving us generously extra months to help with the transition. So I'd like to introduce Tom Lucchese, who's here with his family tonight. And Tom is going to just give a little bit of background, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good evening again. Thank you very much for having me. I'd like to thank the council, the mayor, and administrator once again for allowing me to introduce myself this evening. My name is Tom Lucchese. With me this evening is my wife, Elizabeth, and my two children, Thomas and TJ. Quite honestly, without their support, I would not be here tonight, so I want to make sure I recognize them. I've dedicated my life to the fire service. I started about 12 years old hanging around the local volunteer firehouse, riding my bicycle with fire calls. Coincidentally, that's what my son Landon is doing now. I joined the fire department when I was 16 years old. I spent 26 years there so far. Through that time, I've progressed through the ranks to be chief of the department. And quite honestly, once again, I would not be where I am if it was not for my start in the volunteer fire department. I will admit, it's extremely hard dedicating your time to a volunteer fire department. I'm sure my wife's shaking her head back there because she sees the dedication that it takes to be an active member there. I'm as active today as I was when I was 16 years old, which is not easy to do. I became an emergency medical technician before I even graduated high school. When I graduated high school, I used to work the ambulance at night and go to school during the day. I've been a code enforcement officer since 2002, working as a fire inspector for the Town of New Windsor Fire Inspector's Office, at first full-time and then part-time. I ask that everyone in the audience think back when you were a child. Oftentimes you were asked what you want to be when you grow up. Typical answers is maybe an astronaut, a teacher. My answer was always, I want to be a firefighter. That's all I ever wanted to be. In 2007, I was able to fulfill my lifelong dream and become a career firefighter with the City of Newburgh Fire Department. Through my time there, I was promoted several times, from lieutenant to captain to finally assistant chief, which I am today. I have to say, my time there, I feel very grateful for, and I always kept in mind what it felt like the very first day I walked through the door of the firehouse. I felt extremely fortunate being able to live out my lifelong dream. Every day since then, every time I walk through the doors of the firehouse, that's how I feel. Like I was very fortunate to be able to fulfill my lifelong dream. Moving on from the fire department, I'm a small business owner as well. I started my own business in 2012. First as a safety consulting business. Over that time, it sort of morphed into, I now contract with volunteer fire departments on administrative tasks, either as a purchasing agent or a district administrator. I just recently received a contract acting as a clerk of the works for a $22 million new firehouse construction project. As a volunteer firefighter over the last 26, 27 years, I've seen the struggles that volunteer fire departments face. Over that time, manpower has dwindled. It's much harder for firefighters or for fire departments to find volunteers to dedicate their time. It's not just a local problem, it's not a state problem, it's a problem found throughout the United States. I know Beacon is no different than that. You know, over the last 20 years, they've had a decline in volunteers. It's a big problem. The state is trying to address that, and there's no real easy answer for that. Unfortunately, it's now common for volunteer fire departments not to be able to respond to fire calls, right, which unfortunately is much more common than it used to be. There's now volunteer fire departments that are now talking about or have went to getting career staffing to supplement their volunteers. Just locally in Dutchess County, there's combination fire departments that have doubled their staffing in the last 10 years. I know Beacon has been trying to set up for success by increasing their staffing and trying to do different things to increase their recruitment of volunteer members. I do feel under the City Council and the Mayor and Chief Van Voorhis, you guys have taken the steps to try and set Beacon up for success. This includes continuing to professionalize the department and transition to a central fire station. As chief, I plan to continue to increase volunteer recruitment efforts to hopefully bolster the ranks of volunteer firefighters. As chief, I promised the council, the mayor, both the volunteer and career members of the City of Beacon Fire Department, more importantly, the residents of the City of Beacon, I will pick up where Chief Van Voorhis left off and try to move the department forward, as well as increase recruitment efforts for your volunteer firefighters. Thank you.
As I mentioned to the council in executive session last night, Tom will be coming on with us part-time in the beginning. So we're appointing him provisionally. He's taken the civil service test to be eligible for the position. We hope that test will come out. The scores will be released this summer, and it's about the same time that he'll be retiring from the City of Newburgh in his assistant chief job. So again, Gary's going to help with the transition. We're going to start with Tom 3 days a week, and then upon the release of the scores and upon his retirement, we would appoint him permanently.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom. And I do want to say Tom was the unanimous first choice of the committee that was comprised of the chief, 2 of the lieutenants, myself, and the HR director. So we're really, really pleased.
So I will refer to you as Assistant Chief Lucchese for now. The other title will come when when Chief Van Voorhis is ready. So, or maybe, I guess there'll be 2. Will we have 2 chiefs for a little while? Is that how it's going to work?
We are going to have 2 chiefs for a brief period. So
Okay.
you did that with city administrator. There
I
were actually 2
understand.
of us for 2 weeks.
I understand. It's actually a really, really smart way to do transitions, so I'm all for it.
Well, and again, Gary can really then help us too with the fire house project as long as he's willing to continue to serve. So while Tom's getting up to speed, Gary can help with some of the project.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks for coming tonight. Nice to meet you.
Next item on the agenda is a discussion on housing, and I'm asking John to lead that if you would.
Bring up my screen.
I know we put a number of ideas together, I think it was a year or so ago. I assume you're going to go through some of those, and we have some other ones, right?
Yes.
That'd be great.
So I went back and looked at the 21 memo and revised it, switched things around a little bit, but many of these ideas have been on the agenda for a while. The first one, I think, which is the easiest and might have the significant impact, is to take another look at the Senior Affordable Housing Overlay District, which is in the zoning code, but is, as far as I can tell, it was adopted in 2012. It was adopted only for one site. So even though it's called an overlay zone, the restrictions in it are such that only one plot in the city can qualify, more or less. They have things in there that has to be a building over 50 years old and does not allow new construction and has a very low sort of suburban scale for units per acre development potential. So it really doesn't work as a senior affordable housing overlay, other than it was useful when they wanted to convert the hospital to Highland Meadows. So it was set up for that, but it's on as an overlay district. There's no reason you couldn't change some of the basic parameters of the district very easily. You know, take a dozen or so changes, and you could make it available for any lot of any size you want in the city. So I listed some of the really basic things you'd want to change. First of all, allow new construction, not just adaptive use of an existing building over 50 years old. Substantially increase the allowable units per acre, for instance, to what's allowed currently in the GB district. Reduce the required project size. Right now you have to have a minimum 20 well. There's no reason you couldn't apply this to a small scale lot and put in 5 or 10 senior affordable housing units, and make it more flexible for some of the smaller lots that are available in the city. Really lower the required parking standard. Right now it's 1.2 spaces per unit. Everywhere else in the city, if you build senior housing, it's 0.66 spaces per unit. So it's like double what you need. And I don't understand why that got adopted, other than Highland Meadows had a lot of parking lot already, so they just put it in there. I would suggest decreasing the eligible age limit. Right now it's 62, you could bring it down to 55 or 60 or something. The point is to make it more flexible so you solicit proposals from willing developers who are interested in building senior affordable housing. Right now, the percentage of the area median income is 100%. I would suggest, again, bring it down to 70 or 80% so you target lower income residents. And finally, to eliminate this requirement for a special permit from the city council. So since the city first has to declare it a senior housing overlay zone, so you've already gone through the approval process by the council in the rezoning process, so why do you have to have a special permit on top of that? It just delays the factor and makes some people think that, well, I could go all through all this hassle and not get my special permit because the neighbors complain or whatever. So that's the first thing on the table. I don't know if you want to have some discussion about that, whether that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's funny, this is one of the few zones I'm not familiar with, so.
It's never been used.
Well, obviously it was adopted for the Highland Hospital site, which means I think, George, you were around for this?
Yeah, I believe so.
And it was really, it looks very tailored to that site. I mean, 4 per acre it would be silly almost anywhere else in the city, but that site has a lot of room, had a lot of parking. This is clearly tailored for that site. Makes a ton of sense. You were around for some of this. What do you think of this?
Well, I don't remember 2012, but I know I was here and sitting in a seat. No, it makes sense, and I'm glad you kind of dug this up and brushed it off and take a fresh look at it, because I think it can be applied on smaller scale and with looser restrictions, and I think that would serve part of our community that I think is underserved, certainly.
Can you share a little bit more about the benefit of an overlay district, just how those work generally, and why this might prompt the kind of development we're looking for?
Well, I have a few illustrations here. This is the zoning map of the city, and all that yellow is R1 districts. So 85–90% of the city does not allow multifamily housing or attached housing. All it allows is single-family housing and accessory units, not even two-family housing.
Right,
So-
and our accessory units have been there for 25 years,
Right.
almost 30 years on the books, and all we did recently was make it a little easier, but that's been the only thing other than single-family there, right?
Yes. So in order for somebody to build a multiple family senior housing project, if they're interested in doing such thing, there's very limited land, because the LI is not allowed, the light industrial, and some of the other ones, the land's more expensive, it's right in the middle of things. So in order to provide some options for some bigger parcels that are within that R1 district, you would have an overlay zone. A developer would come to you, or you could negotiate with a developer, a willing developer, to find a spot and negotiate with the landowner to say, bring it forward as a possible, this parcel would be specially zoned for the senior housing overlay district. And the developer could get it rezoned, and then therefore you could allow for multifamily housing within one of the R1 districts. Or even the RD districts that have, a lot of the RD districts are allowed multifamily, but they're 5,000 square foot per unit, or 10,000 square foot. They're more than they need to be if you're having senior affordable housing, where you could have smaller units, less parking, hopefully even closer to walkability to the center rather than Highland Meadows or whatever the other one is.
Meadow Ridge.
Meadow Ridge, right. So I looked at 4, and these are just sample parcels that I pulled off the parcel access. I have no idea whether they're willing or interested or anything about these, whether there's environmental impacts that couldn't be handled or whatever. But just to show how it might work on 4 sample parcels of varying sizes. So the first one is the Elks parcel. Everybody probably knows where that is, on the corner of Walcott and Tioronda.
Top left, right?
Yes.
Top left.
So that's 3.9 acres. About half of it is used by the Elks. Half of it is a big lawn. So it's in the R15 district. It would be capable of having 16 units, single-family homes. Whether you could fit 16 5,000 square foot lots on there, I'm not so sure, but that's what the zoning would allow. If you, for instance, change the single senior affordable housing overlay zone to allow houses with the same development potential as in the transitional district, which is 2,500 units square feet per acre or per unit, you'd get 33 units capable of being put on that parcel. And if you went to the same development potential as in the GB district, you could go up to 56 units per acre. So on that one parcel, you could put 50-some units of senior affordable housing within easy walking distance of Main Street. And the Elks would be able to take advantage of some of their land for beneficial purposes. The other ones, I don't know if you want to keep going on this, but I showed Hedgewood, which is an existing assisted senior facility out on Fishkill Avenue. It's got 6.1 acres. It's got some environmental impacts on a quarter of the parcel or so, but you could still build on the highland behind. And then again, there you could fit, for instance, 53 units or 87 units, depending on what sort of development potential you're interested in allowing on these parcels. I thought this might be a way of, consistent with other zoning districts in the city, being able to compare what makes sense on a parcel like this. And even smaller parcels like the vacant club building up on the hill above the Hebrew Alliance off Verplank Avenue. That's 1.2 acres. In theory, you could build on any part of that lot except maybe the steep slopes along the western edge. And you could get, say, 20 to 34 units on that property, depending on how dense you would permit the development to be. And then finally, even a smaller lot, this is .31 acres, it's a vacant lot at the corner of Chestnut and Church. Right now, it's in the transitional district. You get 5 units. You could get multifamily there already, but if you allowed it at the same density as the general business district, you could get 9 units, and that might make it more apt to be an attractive developer with enough economies of scale to put in a multifamily development on even that small parcel. So there's opportunities in the city, if the city was really looking for affordable housing options for seniors. You could change the zoning law, allow the same sort of density that you have in the general business district, and you could negotiate with potential landowners to come in with a proposal for the senior affordable housing overlay district.
Okay. Any questions on that before we go on to more suggestions?
Only that it might lead to other points that, John, you may make later, but in terms of the actual, like, if they were to be built, these senior units, where would you put it in if you wanted to have a less traditional design, like where there's smaller units, shared kitchens, things like
Right.
that? Would that be in the actual zoning language,
Yeah,
or?
that would be allowed under the existing zoning. Those sorts of things are allowed, for instance, like the Highland Meadows.
Mhm.
I would simplify the code, that overlay district, as much as possible to allow as much flexibility as possible.
Mhm.
That's the whole point. You want to attract interest in these parcels,
Right.
because it does take a 2-step process. You first have to rezone it, and then it has to go through site plan. So the more flexibility you have, the more likelihood you are to get interested parties
Mhm.
and interested landowners.
Yeah, and I know it's becoming a popular design as these micro units in the cities and various other urban environments, where it's appealing to a lot of people because they don't want to have the big house, the big studio, the big kitchen that's never used.
Right.
So as much as we could encourage that kind of development, I think would also open up opportunities.
Yeah. Downsizing is a big issue. There's a lot of people my generation who are looking to get rid of my house and move into something more central, more walkable, more, flexible in terms of accessibility, not having stairs and those sorts of things.
And I think it appeals on different generations, younger generations too. They don't need all that either because they're going out and they spend less time at home.
I have some interesting ideas on that one too.
Yeah, okay,
Up
good.
front.
Well,
So you want to move on?
Okay.
Sorry, I have a quick question. Do we have the right, and I'm not saying we should discuss this specifically today, to do other kinds of affordable housing overlay districts?
Sure.
Okay.
You could actually take the senior housing overlay district and make it more flexible and just make it an affordable housing overlay district with a senior component. If there's, people over that age and they want to target it, you would have a subset of the regulations apply to them if there would needed to be any extra provisions in terms of accessibility and things like that.
And Molly, when we were talking about it, one of the reasons we thought we'd put senior housing forward is because it generally has less of an impact than broader housing. The seniors tend to have no or many fewer children. Like if they have an adoptee, they might, if we lowered the age to 55, you might still have some, but you're not adding a lot of capacity
Right,
that
and
the
then
school.
the need for parking as well.
The
may be
need for
different,
parking
so,
is much
yeah.
less. And then the other thing is there's not a lot of units that are adapted for older people. So like, there's a lot of people that are living in their homes, and they might be willing to put those homes on the market if they had a readily adaptable, accessible apartment that had an elevator, grab bars, wide enough doors, so that they could age in place and they didn't have to leave.
Right. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, it was more, for now, just a question to know if we had that option, less about, I'm thinking that we don't need senior stuff, so.
Right now you don't, but you could. Parking is a big issue, more than you would think. I looked it up, and multifamily parking typically represents about 10 to 20% of the total housing costs, the parking lot. and it adds 17% to the average apartment's rent. That's national numbers. And if you look at it for lower income people, it's a higher percentage of their rent is based on parking because their rents are smaller and the price of a parking space is relatively fixed. And they tend to have lower number of automobiles. So you're doubly making it regressive by having mandatory parking standards, or at least parking standards that are higher than they need to be. So around the country, people are getting rid of parking standards. Over 200 communities, cities around the country have eliminated parking requirements altogether and just require people to come to the planning board and say what they need and have a parking study to show what's necessary and how they're going to limit the parking demand. So it gives the encouragement. Right now, you know, you think about our values, what sort of values we have when parking is mandatory for every use in the city and is almost always free, whereas housing for people is very expensive and has all sorts of restrictions that prevent you from building it. Density restrictions, all the rest of it. Why is parking mandatory? Why every unit has to have a bathroom, a kitchen, and a parking spot? And we live in a city where a lot of people don't have cars, or at least they only have one car, and yet they're required to have 2 parking spaces for almost everything. And the parking standards have been around since the 70s, as far as I can tell. And the number of people per unit has gone down over 25% in the last 50 years. So there's fewer people in each building, but we're still requiring the same number of parking spaces. And then we make parking mandatory. So we require every building in the city to be car dependent. And then it opens up the project for criticism that is going to cause traffic impacts because of all the parking spaces. So a lot of communities have looked at this, especially ones with good accessibility, good walk scores, good transit. Most of Beacon is walkable. You can get almost everywhere you need. There's a grocery store within walking distance of most people. There's e-bikes and all sorts of mobility options these days. So the point being is many communities, and I looked it up, in just the Northeast, Hudson has eliminated all parking requirements. Hartford, Buffalo, Boston, Bridgeport, and Burlington, just in the Northeast. And a lot of places just do it in the central business district because there's on-street parking and public lots available. They still require it elsewhere, but in the central business districts, Syracuse, Schenectady, Ithaca, Rochester, Scranton, and Brattleboro all have eliminated parking in their central business districts as a requirement. Now, you could eliminate it. I think that's worth discussing, but you could also cut it back a lot. You could cut it in half, and you'd probably still have enough parking for everybody who needs it. And it would, you know, some communities are even requiring developers to unbundle the cost of parking from rent so that you're charged a separate fee for a parking space and a separate fee. So it reduces your rent almost automatically unless you have the 2 cars or whatever the requirement is under the code now. So there's a lot of options out there in terms of parking. Your standards are overbuilding parking, except for perhaps in the central Main Street and the linkage districts where they were cut down previously. But most of the city is still operating under the 1970 parking standards where the planning board has to create enough parking to meet the code, or the potential developer has to go through a variance process, which is burdensome and not always successful. So I have at least suggested that for designated affordable units, so if you're requiring 10% of the units to be affordable, make those not require parking. So at least there's some extra subsidy for requiring an affordable unit that you won't have to provide a parking spot for that. And that I suggest you also go back and look at the parking standards in general and reduce them substantially.
I'm interested in this broader view that you're suggesting of sort of prioritizing other modes of transportation other than vehicles for those who are able. Obviously, we don't want to, in this conversation, discount people who can only travel via personal vehicle. And I anecdotally understand that while there are alternate transit options in Beacon, they are not necessarily adequate to fully replace a vehicle for many people.
Right.
And so I'm curious if there's a way to look at this, and I defer to you on what exactly the mechanism to look at this would be, of if there is sort of a transit district or a transit overlay. We're discussing potentially investing in a bicycle route, if housing that's along a route that is more accessible, housing that is along existing bus routes, if we do invest in having our bus routes more regularly used, and to really be looking at what alternatives to personal vehicles we're offering people if we are restricting parking, and sort of having those two things be in tandem.
Yeah, some communities link the reduction or elimination of parking based on how far they are from a viable transit route for places that have good transit. I would say Beacon doesn't have good transit at this point.
Okay.
So
we do agree on that.
yeah,
I just want to remind you, though, we are on a railroad line, which is what caused the revitalization of Beacon, in my mind.
Yes.
So while we don't have the best intra-city, we do have a great transit line that goes anywhere you want to go.
yes.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that there are some really great parts of our transit system, and I'm not trying to say that.
I agree. Yeah. But
all
it's
bad.
hit or miss. It's not certainly, there's not good coverage through the
Right.
city, so that everybody can say, well, I'm within 500 feet of a transit line.
And we are working with Dutchess Transit, try to expand hours, expand days, and optimize routes. So again, that's a management issue. How you design the community is fundamental to whether transit can work, because if you don't have the density, it's a lot easier to support transit when you have density, and that's why, like, the governor's proposing to do transit-oriented development, which I know John is going to talk about.
So, yeah, my first reaction listening to this is, why do we have any parking requirements at all? Think it would be okay not to have any. I mean, obviously, if you're doing construction, part of the planning process will be, what do you think the parking is? How are you going to do that? But imposing the requirement up front, I just don't see the point anymore, so.
Well, that's, Buffalo, for instance, did this several years ago, and what they found is that number of parking spaces went down something like 30 or 40%. I can't remember what the number is, so don't quote me on that one, but it went down substantially, and they've had no problems. And what they do is, if there's any major development that comes in, they have them do a parking and transit traffic study, and they go through, well, how can you cut down the number of, so they shape the development to provide alternatives as part of the development. So they say, well, can you put in a bike room for bike storage? Can you, is it within so many feet of a transit route? And they come up with a logical, and most developers will not build something if it's going to be a problem for their tenants. They require enough parking to meet their needs. Most banks won't lend to a development that is going to have problems leasing space because there's no parking. So they end up, the projects provide enough parking, but they provide enough for what they think is necessary rather than what some arbitrary requirement that was put in 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So at any rate, my suggestion is at the very least you do eliminate the parking for designated affordable units, lower it for seniors in particular, and lower it for other multifamily, because right now you require over-parking for. The planning board is just working on a project up at Groveville Mills, a new proposal with 28 housing units and so many square feet of studio space. And we found that it was just overwhelming, the number of parking spaces that were required in the zoning for up there. So we found ways in the code to bring the parking down, but they're still providing a lot of parking.
Yeah, I could see the argument applying to single-family. Obviously, a single-family home has a parking requirement. If they want to do an accessory unit, we would impose an additional parking requirement, if I'm not mistaken.
Right now, yes.
And the
Although the
question...
planning board has the right to waive it under certain circumstances.
Okay, because, yeah, even there, it's sort of like, is that the best use of our space? Is to impose parking requirements on single-family? I'm just, my first reaction is I'm not sure why we should do any parking requirements
Yeah,
anymore.
But if it's 2 now, you could bring it down to 1 and see how it
Right.
goes.
Right. Well, that would happen on
And if
its
people have
own.
2 cars, they'll put it in on the lot because they need places to park.
Right.
And we've seen with some of our staff even that are younger, that they don't want to own cars. So they're doing car share, they're doing, on-demand, things like Uber.
Yeah.
And then when they need to, they'll rent a car for a long-term trip.
Yeah, I tried to find under the census how many cars people have on average. They do that. The closest I came was in the 5-year ACS latest one, said that 28% of the city has only 1 or 0 cars available in the household. So there's a substantial number of households in Beacon that don't have cars or only have 1 car, and yet every single-family house has to have 2 parking spaces on their subdivision plat. And
I think there are a lot of spaces in Beacon where it makes sense to remove the parking requirement. I mean, places that are like close to Main Street, places closer to the west side of Beacon, near the transit lines, etc. But then when you get over toward the east, I think it gets a little more complicated. And I don't think we shouldn't reduce any parking at all. But I don't know, I think it might make sense to have some parking requirements in some areas of Beacon, because I know there are some council members' houses that I will not walk to because that is too far. And I love walking. I don't have a car. And so I love being able to walk wherever I want to go in Beacon, but at the same time, there are some places that even I find a little too far in Beacon to go. And I think we're just not there yet entirely in some parts of Beacon, but I think in others we can definitely.
yeah, I think that makes sense to do it, just, to phase it in and see how it works, test it in the Central Main Street District, for instance, or that's sort of it.
Have you heard of any municipalities, either on their own or through partnerships with developers, who have encouraged rideshare programs as a kind of means in between, that at least it's not private car ownership, but it's still based on the idea that you need a car to get to a lot of places?
Yeah, there have been, around the country, there have been a lot of either reduced parking developments that go in advertising that we have for rideshare cars, or we have this service, and we have this pickup lane for Uber, and they're designed for car sharing. There was an article just recently, I have it here, if anybody's interested, in Charlotte and in Houston, of all places. They're allowing car-free projects to be approved, as long as they've come up with alternative methodologies to deal with people's transportation needs. And so it's self-selection. The tenant goes in there and says, I'm willing to be without a car. There's no parking space for me, but I'm going to get 10 or 15% off the rent compared to everywhere else in the city. And to me, that makes sense. And these places are leasing up. They're being successful. There's enough of a track record to show that it can work. So you certainly, in certain specific locations in particular, you could do car-free development, and on lots that can't support parking lots, there's a lot of them. And the tenants will understand that when they sign the lease.
Yeah, I'm curious to understand the mechanisms for a law like that, for unbundling parking from the rent, and sort of how that's policy is enforceable.
Yes, I wondered that myself. I was trying to figure out how I could zone for that, but in San Francisco, they apparently do that. Maybe it's on projects that, specialized projects that have council approval or something like that. They require it as a condition. But I'll have to dig into, but certainly it's a strategy that works.
Yeah, I like the idea that you would get a discount on rent, that it's an incentive in that way, but I don't understand how it would work.
While I'm interested in exploring this idea further, I also don't want to discount all of the voices that are saying there isn't enough parking in Beacon, especially on weekends and on Main Street. You know, it's crazy, to say the least.
But if you think about it, almost all the peak parking problems are caused by outside people. You know, on Wednesdays, there's no parking problem in Beacon, and that's because the residents are here on Wednesdays. It's on weekends where there are specialized holidays and those sorts of things where the big parking crash. So it's actually visitors who are creating the peak parking problems, not residents. So requiring residents to have extra parking is not the cause of or the solution for parking issues on the weekends.
I just want to make sure that it's clear, like in this discussion, when people hear, oh, the city council is thinking about removing parking, we already don't have enough parking, you know, that it's clear that we're talking about residential parking and the requirements there.
Yes, and particularly as an impetus for affordable housing, because the fewer parking spaces, the more affordable the units are.
And we are, just so the public knows, also working on the parking issue with people that visit. So once the firehouse is done, we're going to have 52 public spots there that can be utilized on the west end. We're in negotiations for another lot on the east end. And we're going to go lot by lot that are underutilized and see if we can make arrangements for those to become public parking. There are lots that you see empty all week, maybe one day a week they're filled, and then so we have some work to do on that. And then we're also painting parking stalls on all of the perpendicular streets to Main Street over the next 2 years per the Main Street Access Committee. A lot of people don't know that they can park on those side roads. And once we mark that, A, they'll know they can park there, and B, it'll be more efficiently laid out. So we are trying to address that. There's no doubt that that needs attention.
Maybe we should move on. Number 3 is identify opportunities for additional RD districts. Right now you have RD districts throughout the city, but they're all built out or under construction. So the city council could put the word out that you're interested on, say, those 4 parcels I showed or any other parcel where there's a potential for more development that you're interested in.
And John, could you describe an RD district for
RD
people that are tuning in?
Yeah. What does it actually stand for? Residential density or something?
Residential density,
Yeah, it's essentially a multifamily zone that is like an overlay zone that can be placed anywhere in the city. And there's a variety of different RD districts at all different numbers of square feet per unit. And just like, for instance, what you suggested, the overlay zone could be an affordable housing overlay zone, and with a senior component piece, so that in place of the RD districts, you could use that overlay district specifically to promote affordable housing, perhaps at higher percentages than would be required of a private developer on an RD district, which would be 10%.
I apologize. RD is designed residence district.
Oh, sorry. Right now in the RD districts, you have to go through a rezoning process to get the council to change it from a R1 district to an RD district to allow multifamily homes. But then also you have to go through a special permit process with the city council, and then you have to go to the planning board for a site plan process. And usually the way it works, because planning board does most seeker, is you get passed back and forth between the 2 boards. So if you already have to go through the council and get it approved to be an RD district, why do you have to have a special permit? So I'm suggesting that you take away the need for a special permit in the RD districts. It just eliminates one more step in the process, which is a discouragement for doing these sorts of affordable housing and housing projects in general. And all that means is in the use table, you would take off asterisks. And it would make a big difference. And a lot of people don't go for these sorts of things because they know that the process is so onerous, that involves so many steps, that you would put out a lot of money and time and consultant expertise and may get turned down. A special permit gives you the right to say no, even after you've had it rezoned because something comes up. Another idea would be to allow two-family dwelling units in the R1 districts without a special permit. Right now, there's no two-family are only allowed in the T district, the transitional district. And I'm not as sure. Check on that. But they're not allowed in the R1 district, which we've seen is 90-some% of the city. So the only places they're allowed is in the T district and the RD districts. And the RD districts, it's unlikely to have a two-family dwelling. So that would be one option. They have low impacts. They're not much different than a single-family home in appearance, and other than maybe an extra car in the driveway that you usually can't tell the difference between a two-family and a one-family home. And it would allow a lot of people who want to age in place. For instance, they have a house in a residential district, and they can't make the stairs anymore, and they have a bedroom downstairs. They could live on the first floor, rent out the second floor, make it a two-family home with only the change in, the mailbox, and maybe an extra parking space. But that's not allowed by zoning right now. Two-family homes are essentially gone out of style. Nobody does them anymore because they're essentially not permitted. And I would bet that there were a lot of two-family homes in Beacon in the past before zoning went into effect. So that's a simple way to sort of ease some sort of development opportunities in single-family home districts without severe impacts. And then I wanted to point out, and I know we don't want to drag this out too long tonight, but housing in general is good in terms of stabilizing rent and prices. The governor has come up with a proposal. She has advocated that cities like Beacon should add 3% to the housing stock every year for 3 years. That's about 180 units a year for 3 years. That's never been done in Beacon.
Is it 1% per year for 3 years or 3%?
I think it's 3.
I thought it was 3 over 3.
I thought it was 3 over 3.
3 over 3, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think we meet it just with Edgewater.
Yeah, that was the only year where we produced enough housing that would meet that standard.
Go, Christian.
That's just housing in general, not strictly affordable housing?
Well, she's
It's
talking
units.
about just housing.
Just
Yeah,
housing.
it's just
not affordable.
units.
Because the argument is that the more housing you have, it filters down and creates more affordable housing opportunities because the people who have the money are not competing for the same housing stock. They'll go into the newer units, the more expensive units. So housing is good. Housing is in short supply. Housing, a good percent of the unaffordability is based on the fact that we're not keeping up with the housing demand in the market. There's a separate argument as how many of those can be affordable, but housing in general is in short supply, and that's driving up the market. So I wanted to look at a couple opportunities for housing in general, which would also apply affordable housing. And particularly, we've talked in the past about providing housing on public properties, particularly parking lots, so there'd be no displacement involved except perhaps cars. And I've been told by the city administration that they're short on staff and high on capital projects in the next couple of years, and
See, I don't just tell you all that. Even the planner gets it.
So I found two that would not involve city staff in any
Sorry, I was just
in any strong degree, or at least has that option. The first is the county center parking lot at Elm Street. And here it is up there. This was proposed as far back as 2007 in the first comprehensive plan that I worked on. It makes so much sense because the existing parking lot is right on a prime corner, has a big gaping frontage on Main Street. It's really inefficient the way it's laid out, so that you could rearrange it and get the same or more spaces without nearly the amount of space taken up by parking. It's poorly landscaped, has almost no interior trees. I don't think it has any interior trees. It's just not it's a big hole out there, and it's always about 50% empty or more. Even when the Main Street Access Committee did their peak parking day study, this lot was at 51% capacity on a Saturday in the peak season of October.
John, was that before the new parking signs were put up?
After.
It was after, okay,
Oh, yeah, well after.
okay.
So in the comprehensive plan, both the 2007 and the 2017, this was shown as a potential project in which you could not only put a building along the frontage of that corner, but also create a green space at a civic building where it would be nice to have a green space. And I've actually modified the version that was in the 2017 plan to make it a little more efficient in terms of size. So I've cut down the width of this building and increased the size of the park since then. And this was a suggestion of the city administrator, although I'm not sure he specifically asked me to do it, but he wanted me to look into micro apartments, which are small-scale apartments designed for one or two
And
people.
bigger parks.
And so I redesigned this proposal for micro apartments so that every unit, even if it wasn't designated affordable, would be affordable because it's small, it's efficient, it's designed for people who don't have cars and don't need a lot of space but want to live in the city of Beacon and use their bikes or use their feet.
I'm sorry to interrupt. What's the square footage of like a micro apartment?
Usually it's considered like under 300 square feet. These are 280. And so you can get 40 micro apartments on a 3-story building with commercial on the ground floor, so 2 levels of residential.
But even if you do twice that, you're doing something different. Like some of these units coming on now that are luxury condos are 2,000 to 3,000 square feet. They're like a single-family home in a condo, and that's why they cost $1 million. You know, we're trying to build housing that's not just luxury, but it's, you know, it's nice housing, but it's not luxury. And again, going to a smaller size can help with that.
And the parking standards is actually what drives a lot of these, because providing you don't have enough parking on your lot, and so the fewer units you put in a building and raise the price. So the parking standard actually forces up the size of the units, and because if you only have room for 8 parking spots, you're going to create 8 units, even if they're 2,500 square feet and, you know, penthouse type units. So this is going the opposite rate. Nobody is building anything close to this in the city, and I think there's a need, or at least there's a market for small units that are more efficient for people who like to spend their time outside and don't need a lot of space, don't need a lot of upkeep, don't need a car. And so here's a corner building that the city and the county could cooperate on. The county could run the process through the county planning department in terms of doing the final request for proposals and working with the developer and coming up with the details of how it's going to work and how to finance it. The city could get a green space out of it. It could be part of the farmer's market. So the green could be designed to be the sort of entry for the farmer's market where people who don't have cars, have just tables, could set up in the perimeter of the green, and then the people who want to have cars and trucks as part of their displays would be led back into the back parking lot. So you could work with the farmer's market to make that green space really usable for the farmer's market. And it could be designed to create the sort of first green space, public green space on Main Street.
So you get about several different independent concepts in here, right?
Yes.
One is building on a public lot.
Yep.
And then in particular, the county one, because, their planners can get involved, right? So there's the
They can
second
do the
idea,
work.
right? And the third one is putting a building there. The third one is making it micro as opposed to regular.
Right.
Yeah, so there's several different concepts here. Were you imagining decking the parking lot in the back or not? This one doesn't, right?
This one
Well,
doesn't.
no, alls I did, I redesigned the back parking lot so that right now there's 92 spaces on the whole lot,
Right,
and now it would have 114 spaces on just the back two-thirds.
right, because then if you decked it, you could actually expand the size of the building you're building. You could push it down further in.
You
Right, so
could.
there's a number of different, I'm just saying, there's some really good concepts in
Yeah.
here, and we could break them into parts or do them in groups, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this would not prevent, in the Main Street Access Committee, we designed a parking structure for this location that would work with this building. So you could do it in phases. You could build first live with a surface parking lot until parking got really intense, if it ever does, and then deck over the back and triple the size of the parking lot, or at least double it. And it works with transit. The idea of creating these greens along Main Street in which you could have a transit stop and bus shelter and transit information and the rest of it. So it's a real opportunity here. The county owns it. Right now, all the signs are, the governor's trying to give away money for housing. The county has set up a trust fund, and they're trying to give away money for housing. It's their own lot. Why wouldn't they want to do it, what they're preaching everybody else do on their own parcel? I think it just needs a few meetings and some convincing that this is the best opportunity you're going to run across in the right location.
And they just awarded a Beacon project, 1.57 million for the 2 Cross Street project for 18 units, including 9 for frail elderly that come with supportive housing. So it's they're putting their own money into it. We think if we have consensus, this is something we want to move forward on, and we approach them, it might make for an easy win for somebody who only has a brief time in office left. You have an interim county executive. I understand he wants to do some things before he leaves at the end of the year. So it could be a window in which we could get something at least started.
I think my only hesitation in that timeline is understanding where we might site a community center if we go down that road. I know that project is a massive project, and this is not the only place that it could possibly be developed.
We didn't even consider this lot for that.
Okay, I thought we were still at the phase where we weren't considering any lot at this point, that we were still
It was never even discussed. I mean, the two that there were 3 spots that during the study we talked about the existing site and reinvesting in that because you have a lot of infrastructure there already in terms of your park. We have talked a little bit about putting something at Memorial Park near the school because that makes sense. You have like those old maintenance buildings that aren't great looking, I'm sure we can figure out smarter places to put some of those buildings. And then people had also mentioned the lot on Matawan and Verplank. Now, I don't know that that's a green space, but this never came up as one of those. So I'd just say, I don't think the county would go for a community center there. And it wouldn't be our first choice for a spot. I think our first choice right now is looking like West Center Street, where we've already got quite a facility built.
And it's also proximate to affordable projects.
Yes.
Right? So
You're right next to Beacon Housing Authority, South Davies Terrace. So.
But nothing's decided, right? I'm just.
No, but again, this one didn't even hit the radar for the community center.
I have one more if you want to move on.
Okay.
Unless someone else had on this one. I think this is the best opportunity in the city myself, but that's just me.
And we did do this as part of the DRI application that we put in 2021. Did we do it?
I think it was in one of those DRI.
It was in 2021, and again, that was one of the featured projects in our DRI.
The other opportunity where it wouldn't cost the city in terms of staff time is the Metro North parking lots. The 17 comprehensive plan targeted the 2 parking lots there that create this big hole in the front porch of the city. And it's in zoning. There's a waterfront development district. You can see it on the map. If you're close enough, you can see it on the map. There's the north parking lot was zoned for that purpose, and the south parking lot was zoned for that purpose. In particular, Metro North has expressed interest of late of looking at those. Again, there's state money out there looking at transit-friendly spots that are within walking distance of rail stations. And this would be a very easy parcel to develop in the sense that it's very proximate to the waterfront and the train station. And it's up against a hill. So in the comprehensive plan, it was looked at as a very low impact site because it would not block any views. They actually built a sort of a zoning model for how many floors and how that would be stepped back as you go farther north on the site because the hill goes higher, so that it would be relatively invisible from the city itself. And even Edgewater, which is up on the top of that hill, would be able to see over the top of it. It's, the governor, again, has, one of the suggestions, as I understand it, was 50 units per acre as a encouragement for properties like this next to the train stations. This is a 3.3 acre site, so that at 50 units per acre, it would give you 169 units. That's, a significant number of affordable units. You could, because it's a public project, perhaps negotiate a higher percentage of affordability in a project like this, because in theory, the land is in public ownership already, so the developer wouldn't have to pay for that. It has an interesting south-faced terrace. So here's a project in the South Bronx that's won all sorts of awards because it's terraced up from the south. So in essence, you create at every level of the terrace as it goes up that hill, you get a green roof. And so, and it's also it's LEED Gold rated. It has solar panels on all those south-facing terraces, and it has over 40,000 square feet of green roof and gardens built into the development because of the way that terracing works up the hill. And this has the same sort of configuration, north to south, with the higher part of the building allowed at the north end. So you would develop it in that sort of way. So there's all sorts of green advantages, walkability advantages. It would bolster housing in the city in a very low impact area. And the zoning is already in place for it. So all it needs is to get Metro North, who's been sort of thinking about this for 10 years, to do something.
Yeah, did just understanding what I read in your notes in the packet as well, is your understanding that Metro North is interested in working with us on figuring out, us meaning the city of Beacon, and figuring out what to put in there?
I haven't had any discussions, but I think the city has.
We had a discussion last year, and it sounded like they were considering putting out an RFQ this spring.
Okay.
So it would be what's called a request for qualifications, where they don't necessarily need every detail of the proposal, but they say, give us your proposals, tell us, developers, why you're qualified to do this, what are the projects you've done, what might you propose here if we allow it. So I haven't touched back with them. I think a lot went quiet with Metro North during COVID.
Yeah.
But again, if the council wanted to support something, in theory, I would go back to them. I don't want to go back to them if the council's then going to say, well, we don't want that, because then we're just teasing them on.
Yeah, if you take a look at the long view, Metro North was here 15 years ago, and the city wasn't ready, right? They were making a proposal that was far more massive, higher wasn't, and it would, I
It was
just don't
8
think we were-
stories, I
Yeah.
recall.
Yeah, I don't think we were ready for it. So the reaction from the community, I actually was absent some of that time. I was up in Albany. But as I understand the reaction, there was concern that Main Street couldn't, wasn't firm enough yet. There was concern about height and massiveness. And so since then, we've done our rezoning, and we think the zoning's correct and in place, which is kind of what John is saying. And I think we need to be cautious because Metro North might feel like, fool me once. But having said that, I think we're one of the most attractive locations that they have available on the Metro North grid. We are one of the larger stations. We're larger than anyone north of Croton in terms of boardings. So I think this is an interesting opportunity as long as, they want to come to the table and we can make this work right. But
And
I think our zoning very much is in place
We
now.
talked a little bit about it too, because they did a last mile study that they tried to include us in at the last minute. They wanted somebody in Dutchess. Poughkeepsie ended up not being in the program, and then we, at like the 11th hour, got put in the program, and it didn't work out so great. But I said, look, one of the things we would be interested in talking to you about is the TOD. There's no last mile if they're right there at the station.
Yeah, and the idea would be to replace these people who are park and ride people with walk and ride people. People who take the train in. Why would they want to live in Newburgh or, Fishkill and drive to the station and pay for the extra parking? They can walk to the station and be right there and have river views as well. So the idea is you replace the surface parking with under building parking. You build the housing on top of 2 layers of parking structure so that the housing parking requirements and the commuter parking requirements are handled underneath the building, so you don't have to look at, as you stand on the hill, you don't have to look at acres of parking lot. You look at buildings and the parking is underneath. And the parking pays for the parking structure, or the housing pays for the parking structure.
I don't recall, but in the current zoning, how much, is there an opportunity for commercial development or retail in this?
On this one, it was envisioned that the north lot, because it is more sort of removed and in a somewhat dead-end location, would be residential with perhaps commercial along the West Main Street frontage. And the commercial would happen near the train station on the south side. So if you look at this map down here, was envisioned to be mixed use, a more mixture of commercial and I think the estimates at the time were something like 35,000 square feet of commercial. Perhaps office market is not so hot these days. But the idea here is you build a new train station that would bridge over the tracks and then come across the top of the parking levels in that hole so that you would have a level walk or a somewhat level walk up to Beekman Street, a direct walk up to Beekman Street. So you would cut the walking distance in half up to Main Street, and it would reduce the slopes. You wouldn't have that big switchback you're required to do. And I'll show you the sketches these are the sketches that are in zoning so that there's certain limits on development. In this area, the requirements would be the parking would be below and the housing would be stepped down towards the waterfront, and would never be high enough that it would block the upland views from the existing housing. So this would be lower, more mixed use. I think we're talking about a 3-story limit here, whereas the other one could go up to 4 stories. And it would depend on protecting upland views. So this is a little more complicated because it involves rebuilding the train station, creating an overpass, promenade on the upper level of the parking structure, so you would have this great overlook over the river along the entire front edge, and commercial as well as residential.
Can you go?
So the idea is you start from the north end, build the housing first, demonstrate that this works as a model, and then move to the south.
Can you back up to the prior slide? The one that, yeah, that one. The existing structure in the middle, which is the old Doral hat factory that Metro North owns.
Yes.
Anything happening with that? Do we know?
Not that I know of.
I assume Metro North would not keep that building.
They might not. I think they would do this in certain phases. You would do the north parking lot first, maybe the middle next, and then the south after that. And they own that building. I don't know if they have opportunities elsewhere for all their maintenance equipment. But there's opportunities.
Okay. Just
But I
wanted
would
to thank you.
assume they would be phased in over a longer period of time.
Any other questions? And we're just putting ideas on the table, right? We're not solving anything just yet.
And the governor is offering money, it's being floated out there, but there's infrastructure money and other things that's being proposed, I think, at this point. So there might be funds and stuff to upgrade various infrastructure needs and so on.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what's going to pass in the state budget yet.
Right.
But again, you're going to have, these parking decks are not cheap, and so that might be something that the state is willing to support. The other thing is we'd have to extend and upgrade sewer and water to that site, so hopefully they would do infrastructure. Usually, they're doing infrastructure for green sites, you know, like, okay, let's go develop a farm and run pipes. And the mayor and I have talked to the governor's office about investing in brown sites, and sites that are already urban, but they need upgrades to be able to further develop.
Right.
But I think the state is committed to TOD, and so, you know, we have to see how that commitment translates in terms of the kinds of
Right.
funds that will make it possible, right?
And if they do pass a TOD component, they're going to be looking for communities to work with.
Yeah.
And we can, I mean, when we did RFQ processes up in Ulster County with surplus properties we had, we basically tell them what we're willing to take. You know, so the host community can really define, we want affordable housing, we want mixed income, mixed use, if that's the case. Because when we had talked, I thought they were looking at something that was somewhat mixed use as well, not just exclusively housing. So,
And I think with the TOD, what you're seeing now is the competing interest from the governor who is proposing something that would mandate TOD development and lesser restrictions versus the Assembly and the Senate that are suggesting that should be done by incentives. But you also now have, of course, then what we're hearing is Metro North's interest independent of that. So you have a lot of moving parts, and I think what, from the staff level, we'd find helpful is you have this list of 6 different items, is which ones do you want to sort of move to the top and pursue, because I think you want to make sure you're ready for this, because it's coming, something's going to come out of this year's budget, and I suspect next year's budget is going to be perhaps even continuing that trend and be more aggressive. And to the extent you can be on the ground level and help design and be involved in these discussions with the Beacon TOD in particular, you're in a better position.
Beacon already has this introduced in their comprehensive plan,
Yep.
and the zoning has already been approved. So I think you would be a leg up on a lot of other communities that are just getting started on the process.
I would just want to make sure that they honor our zoning. I think that would have to be central to any negotiation that we have, that we make clear right out of the gate. We have zoned this, we've done this thoughtfully, while they can override our zoning on their land, I believe. I think
never said that
politically,
they would.
they won't. I don't
No.
think they will, but I think we need to say that right out of the gate if we do have that conversation.
Well,
Yeah,
that's the beauty of, if you have the zoning in place, the easy course of getting something
That's
done
right.
within a certain period of time is to go along with the existing zoning rather than start a fight all over again.
And also, I think, you know, the property owner of Metro North, seeing that you've given thought to this thinking with the terracing, it helps them move this ahead of other projects where they know that the community is receptive and that they know what that pathway is to getting a project through as opposed to the unknowns.
The
Yeah,
only
but-
thing I would suggest is that, given our past history, the Beacon's past history, going back to 2001 or something, that the council and the city has to make a commitment that they're willing to do this, because there's other communities that are going to be out for the money as well.
Yep. Yep, agreed. Yeah, and the only way I could see that the way we've zoned this could bump up against something is if somehow in the package there's something we want, and that to get that in there, we might have to think a little differently, because we thought in isolation, right? We said, what works here? And again, I would be willing to look at what the package is, right? Because if it's like, oh, the state's going to take care of all the infrastructure, but what they're interested in as a result is maybe something we hadn't thought of. That might be part of, that would make some sense to have some flexibility to consider. But I like our zoning the way it is. Right?
Well, 2017 zoning had, a comprehensive plan process had a Metro North representative on the committee. And they showed up. And they agreed in principle to the sort of things that were adopted. So
I think the main argument at that time, both in 2007 and 17, and when we passed this current zoning, was that whatever happens here does not suck the energy of Main Street that people have, spent the last 20 years helping, revive. That this is not going to suck all of the tourism and all of the visitors just down to the waterfront, and that they go to DIA and they go there and they never go up to Main Street. So, and I think the zoning that we have in place takes that into consideration, and I think we had a buy-in from Main Street people who were very actively involved in those discussions.
Yep.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, if I think about affordability, that might be, to Luke's point, something to consider if we could get more affordable units in, but I think to George's point, needs to be balanced against what the community has already said is important to them when they participated in the 2017 and 2007 process.
Okay. We're at 8:15. We don't have to reach any decisions. We were just getting ideas on the table. Are we good, or do we want a little more time?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on what Paloma brought up earlier, because I too do remember thoughts of maybe the community center being at that Dutchess County lot. It might have been a conversation said separately, but I do think, and I think Paloma was kind of hinting at this as well, knowing that this might be a good spot for affordable housing and that the county might be open to it, and there is money coming through the county from the state, might mean that that's a parcel that we're open to doing other things with. So I think knowing to think it was John or someone, or maybe it was others who said that there might be elements that we want to move quicker on because of funding that's coming up, knowing how expensive housing is right now.
Okay. We good? You ready to send John home? All right.
Thank you, John.
thank you.
I'm always appreciative of the extent of your knowledge of the community and how you tailor your planning skills to us, so thank you. I hope you're having fun here.
What's that?
I hope you're having fun here,
Oh, yeah.
right? Why bother if you're not having fun, right? Thank you. Okay, next item. A couple of appointments, one Coleman Lawrence to motor equipment operator, and then Chris Servadio to also motor equipment operator. Chris, you want to do those two?
Yes, so we have hired a lot of motor equipment operators in the last few years. It's a competitive market, and we continue to lose people to the private sector. So we're backfilling 2 positions where people left to get higher-paying jobs. And we interviewed 5 people. Coleman and Christopher were the top 2 picks. We still have 1 additional opening, but we didn't have a candidate that we were ready to go for on that. So we want to go for these 2.
I will say that with both of these candidates, as with other ones that have been brought before us recently, they seem to have other skills as well. And I think as we think of our highway department and how closely they work with our water and our wastewater department, having people that can have skills that can apply for different projects or different emergencies or whatever it is that come up, that's great to see that we're continuing to hire with that in mind.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Everybody good? Next item is
Good night,
leaf
John.
blower regulations, and I guess, Nick, you're going to start that up?
That's right, Mayor, thank you. So our office previously advised the council with respect to regulations of leaf blowers. How that is regulated in New York State, certain federal preemption matters concerning the Clean Air Act at the administrative level, and that leaf blowers need to be regulated by noise. We reviewed with you the city code provisions and how lawn and landscaping equipment are exempt from the noise ordinance with certain limitations. And then this was discussed at a city council workshop on February 21st, and we produced in the packet a memo that went through some of the decision questions that were asked of the council and your answers, and we then drafted a proposed law in response to those answers. And so rather than go through the memo, let me go through the law, because I think that is ultimately what we're looking at here. And so we've added, and this is all going in the noise ordinance, chapter 149. So we've added a definition of leaf blower. That's in your packet. And I'll go through an overview, and then we can come back and talk about any specific items you want. Section 149-7G, we just took out, excluding use and operation of leaf blowers and noting that they are regulated in use section 149-7K. And so in 149-7K, these are specific prohibited acts or restricted use and activities with respect to noise. And so K is a new section regarding leaf blowers, and the current language states that leaf blowers, whether electric or fuel powered of any type, would be not able to be used during the period from May 15th through September 30th. So this seasonal limitation is no leaf blowers of any type from May 15th to September 30th. And then during the balance of the time period, from October 1st through May 14th, there's an hours limitation. So electric or gas could be used from October 1st through May 14th, but then we have hours limitations as set forth in section K2. And then section 3 recognizes that in the event of a storm during the period May 15th through September 30th, the highway superintendent could authorize the use of leaf blowers in those circumstances for a period of time not to exceed 7 days, in recognition that we do sometimes get the occasional storm, and that would be appropriate and necessary to use leaf blowers in those situations. And then in section 4, we have an exemption that these restrictions on the use of leaf blowers don't apply to the use or operation of leaf blowers by the city of Beacon, and that was explained regarding their uses, especially with respect to larger properties and also in paving roads, and from an operational standpoint, how those are appropriate and needed, and also on lots greater than 1 acre in size. And so that's the exemption. And then in section 5, we added violations that are consistent with the existing violation provision of the noise ordinance, and then just a technical amendment in section 159-8 on exemptions that exempt from the noise ordinance power tools used for landscaping, lawnmowers, and garden equipment. We've then excluded the use and operation of leaf blowers because those will be regulated in the new section 149-7K. So that's an overview of the law. Again, you have exemptions for the city operations in 1 acre lots. You have an exemption for storm events. You are allowing them at any time in October through May 14th with time limitations. And then from the period May 15th through September 30th, you're not allowing any leaf blowers, electric or gas powered, during that time period.
So we're not outlawing gas?
Correct.
It's just-
That was the consensus.
Right.
Correct.
But I do want to raise that when the CAC, you asked the CAC to do a report on this, and they did a very thoughtful analysis of it. And I don't believe that they had suggested we prohibit electric. I want you to think about the incentive that you're creating. If you want people to transition to a quiet, we know that the electrics aren't perfect, but they are quieter than the gas. And if you were to allow electric leaf blowers, but not gas, you've created an incentive to do some type of transition there. Somehow that got thrown out in the last conversation. So I do feel like we should go back to the CAC memo, because that had this holistic way of looking at it in terms of how we were going to implement it, the time frame for doing that, what you needed to do beforehand. Because that kind of seemed to get lost in the last conversation.
Yeah. One of the things that caught me off guard with this was the time frame that this would be implemented immediately, and I think the CAC mentioned doing an educational program first,
Yeah.
and I talked to several other landscapers in the area, and like a couple of them had said like this would be like a huge whiplash, especially since May 15th, that's a month away. I think I don't want to, I hate being the one saying this, I think we're moving a little too fast. Yeah, no, I don't know that this is ready. Just, yeah, I definitely want to go back and look at the electric part as well. And I don't think, yeah, sorry.
No, and we can have Ben put in, I think we're going to have more than one discussion about this, so we can put the CAC memo back in to kind of inform it. I feel like towards the end, Drew only had a few more meetings. We were trying to get through things quickly. In that, we might have lost some of the original research that had been done.
So we can do that. That's the October 24th memorandum from the CAC. So maybe
Yes.
if we provide that, that was in our packet previously. So if we provide that and the draft law, then maybe, or actually without the draft law, so that we're having, as the mayor said previously, sort of an open discussion, I think that would be a way to frame the next discussion.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we're in a rush. My personal view is that this is not a community-defining issue, right? I mean, okay, it's leaf blowers, right? There's some interest. I mean, they do make noise outside, but I would rather take our time and get it right. I think the odds, the cost of getting it wrong versus the cost of getting it right, I'm willing to take our time.
Yeah, and sort of related to that, I think the idea too of if we are, I don't know if we are as a community, or at least as a council, kind of moving towards, oh, there are other ways you can manage your leaves on your property, and we do want to be encouraging that. I think we need to maybe talk about that more explicitly and be like, what does that mean as a council? What are we saying? What kind of education stuff do we also want to support around alternative ways of managing leaves? Because I think we don't want to like sneak that in as sort of a last minute thing. So I think being more explicit and upfront about that, just in terms of community education, might also be a benefit.
So am I hearing, let's
Yeah.
have the memo and bring it up again?
Yeah, I think bring it up either at the next workshop or whenever it makes sense in our schedule.
Okay, and more of the open discussion, as Nick is suggesting, rather than specific legislation?
I think it's great to have this so we can go back and kind of actually look at like, oh, the point about electric versus gas versus timeline for, versus what do we want to educate the public about. I think, some of the things we talked about or just touched on today. So yes, more open.
Okay. I think that's fine.
I think my one question there is, because I agree in the public education direction that the CAC alluded to, I don't know what sort of city capacity we have to implement something like that. It's not something that at least I've seen the council do on its own before, if that's something we would lean on the CAC to do. So that's just one of my underlying infrastructure questions as we continue this discussion.
To that point, I'd be interested to see if the CAC has suggestions. I'm thinking of the compost. When they rolled that out, there were some videos, so there might be some things. But yes, I think having that explicitly discussed too might be useful. What's in our capacity to educate people?
Will the mayor be on the videos?
Oh, I hope so.
Looking stately or looking silly again?
Just with the leaf blower in your hand.
I'd pay to see that.
I'm always happy to look silly, don't worry. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. So I know we put this down for a while, we picked it up, and it's like, okay, let's talk some more. That's kind of what we're saying, and that's fine. Okay. Next one is, community choice aggregation and community distributed generation. Boy, those are big words. You're going to tell us what those mean, Chris?
Yes, absolutely. Do you want to have this conversation tonight, or do you want to wait for Dan? Dan did request this. I'm sure he'll watch this meeting, so you want to jump into it? Because it's a bit of a long discussion.
I feel like the last one was for Dan as well. I feel
Okay.
a little odd.
Do you want to do it tonight, or?
I'm happy to wait if Dan's, if it's his,
I'm prepared to do it.
I think it would, is there like a short version? I mean, I don't want to waste anyone's time.
Yes, there is a short version.
Yeah.
I'll try to,
Yeah.
I'll tone it down.
And then I do have like one question from a constituent that I hope is a short one when we get there.
I hope it's a short one.
Constituent?
I try to make things short.
Okay. There is a little bit of background and history to understanding what these are. I'm going to give you that, and then I'll tell you where we've been. I'm going to talk about the two models. Both of these models have been designed by New York State to help foster the development of renewable energy. And in the CCA model, or the Community Choice Aggregation, one of the other stated goals is to bring costs down for consumers. So I'm going to just go through three kind of definitions that you need, the public will need, to understand this conversation. Firstly, in the New York State market, we have a deregulated market where the utility that supplies electricity is no longer necessarily the utility that you buy the power from. So we've separated or bifurcated that so that delivery is done by the utility like Central Hudson, and then you can buy power from something called an energy supply company or an ESCO. So some people, like the city, for instance, we buy, Central Hudson bills us for the delivery, and then an ESCO called Constellation Energy actually buys the power on our behalf, and we get a rate that generally is better than Central Hudson. So understanding that, the state promulgated the CCA model, Community Choice Aggregation, and basically what it does is it allows a municipality to partner with an administrator to bid out the supply part of that equation. Like, you can't displace Central Hudson because they own the lines, but you can go back and put out to bid what's called electricity supply, and do so through an electricity supply agreement. Basically what we did is we passed a law in 2017 to say we authorize that so that we can, on behalf of residents and small businesses, pool them into this bid that in our case was more than 10 municipalities, and they go out to bid. And what they do is they bid a fixed rate for electricity. So for a kilowatt hour, you would pay 6, 7, 10 cents, whatever that fixed rate is, as opposed to the variable rate. If you don't have an ESCO and you don't buy electricity from another company, Central Hudson does buy the power for you. And what they do is they go into the New York grid market and they basically buy the power that they can get, and that floats. So at high peak times, like in the summer when everybody's running their air conditioning, that kilowatt hour has gone up to as much as 22 or 23 cents a kilowatt hour. At other points when, like, the economy is fading, during the peak of COVID when people weren't doing a lot, it went down to 5 or 6 cents. So you have Central Hudson with a variable rate, the ESCOs with a fixed rate, and then we basically had we went into this electricity supply contract in July 2019 with an administrator. That administrator is called Joule Assets. Joule is, if you look it up, they do business all over the world. They have a big European department where they do a lot of energy and demand supply services. So we did our first agreement back in 2019 with the goal of getting renewable energy. Now, under that contract, they went out to bid. They got a fixed rate. We chose as a city to make the default option renewable energy. So not only were they buying electricity, but then they were buying what's called a REC, a renewable energy credit, that represents the environmental attributes of electricity. So it basically is supporting some kind of renewable energy within New York State. And that whole thing is tracked through a system called NIGATS, where a hydropower up by the Canadian border, or a wind farm in Madison County or Lewis County is producing this. And you're basically helping to offset the financing for these renewable power projects. So we did a first contract with Joule. That was before I was here and before Lee was mayor. We did a second renewal in June 2021, where we got another fixed rate price. Now, one of the things that I learned when we did that is I had to send a letter out to everybody in Beacon saying, we're putting you into this program on an opt-out basis. So If you don't want to participate, you can send in this card to opt out. And of course, we have some number of people that did it, but generally, when you do an opt-out as opposed to an opt-in, you get much better participation, somewhere in the 85 to 90% range at the highest, and at the lowest, maybe 50%. For an opt-in program, it's much less. It's like 5 or 10%. So we did that second contract, and we basically ended up with an electricity supplier named Columbia Utility Powers, which I'll just call Columbia. And back in March of 2022, things were going well. Our consumers were, in fact, saving money. We were getting power that had renewable energy credits attached to it. The price of power had gone up very high. And then the company that supplied the electricity put in an application to withdraw from the CCA. Yes.
Chris, I was just going to say, we need to be cautious here because we are in litigation with Columbia, so I'm just going to ask you to be mindful of your words.
So I shouldn't call them the names that I have down here? Okay.
Correct, yes.
Okay, good. I'll lay off on the names. So we were informed that they wanted out of that contract. As Nick has just mentioned, we did end up going into litigation to stop them from exiting that contract. They blamed their inability to fulfill their contract on the Central Hudson billing issue. We all know that Central Hudson's billing was a debacle, but it wasn't an excuse for pulling out of this. There were other reasons they pulled out of this. So we went to court along with Jewel and 10 other communities. We were able, thanks in part to Nick, to get a temporary restraining order against the company saying, you know, you are going to have to continue providing power under this agreement. We're going to litigate it. You can't just escape. It's funny, the very next month after the TRO was issued, there was a requirement by the entity that operates the grid in New York State, and that's called the Independent Systems Operator. And they had a collateral agreement. They had to post a certain amount of collateral in order for Columbia to stay in the system. And boy, they couldn't find that money, so they got kicked out of the New York State grid system. And then they turned around and they said, oh, we're done. We can't provide power anymore. We're going to switch everybody back to Central Hudson. That happened mid-billing cycle in July last year, and it was a mess. We had dozens of calls for a number of reasons. One is Central Hudson was telling people that the billing debacle was related to our CCA. That is not true, and Central Hudson since has admitted that that's not true and that their billing issue was separate. We also had a lot of people really confused because that month they got 2 bills. We still are having billing problems. At least once a week, I'm getting calls or emails from people that are having chronic issues with the billing that Central Hudson has been doing. So all of that is context for the question of why didn't we go back into another CCA. So we are still in the litigation, and we were last year, and then in mid-October, Jewel said, well, we're ready to go back into another bid. We're going to get all the, we're going to get the team together again and go out for another bid. And we said, wait a second, we're still in a lawsuit with Columbia. That hasn't been resolved. It's not clear to us that the model that you used that broke is fixed. And then we also began questioning, is this actually the best time to lock into a fixed rate when the variable rate had come down a lot, and we're not clear what's going to happen in the next months. You're in a very volatile time of the economy. If the economy goes down, if you have economic issues, usually electricity use goes down and the price of that commodity goes down. So in late October, Jewel informed us that if we wanted to participate, we had to make a decision within like a month to post something on our website. We had multiple conversations between our attorneys, the mayor, myself, Jessica Stromback, the CEO of Jewel, Glenn Weisberg, yes, I believe, and we basically said, look, we're uncomfortable moving forward this quickly. Why don't you wait until next year? Let's see let's let the Central Hudson billing issues resolve out. Let's see where the litigation goes and if there's any penalty assessed to Columbia so that there's actually accountability on these contracts. Let's see what the Public Service Commission, which is the regulatory body in New York, does to Columbia, because they were also going to take action. So by mid-November, we basically were given, well, you got to get on board the train now or the train's leaving. We brought that to you immediately. On November 14th, we did an executive session. Nick and I outlined this entire thing to the council. To hear some weeks ago that we weren't being transparent is just not accurate. We brought this to the council, and we were very clear about what we were doing and why we were deciding that. In the resolution that provided for the contract back in 2021, the mayor was given discretion whether or not to enter an electricity agreement or not. The council authorized the bid, but the mayor was given the discretion of whether to do that. And when we
That was
looked,
true, Chris, for each and every community because of the way the nature of the contract was being bid in the short turnaround time period.
yes. So then following that executive session, you were getting questions from the public, and I did a memo to you that I believe we allowed to be released publicly. Now they're going back into a new bid, and we're getting questions. Some of those questions were coming from people that actually worked for Juul. So I need you to know that Hudson Valley Community Power works for Juul. They're a separate nonprofit entity, but they are a contractor for Juul. So again, we tried to find a way forward, which brings us to the second model. We began having discussions with other cities like the city of Kingston that isn't in this program and that was trying to do something more innovative. And that's where CDG, or Community Development, Community Distributed Generation, comes in. And this is something some of us already use in our own households. Again, go back to, you have a supply company, which is your utility, which is Central Hudson. You have an ESCO that actually provides the power. Now I'm going to throw in a third thing, which is community solar, or CDG. Basically, this is a model by which they develop new renewable energy, particularly solar, in our area. So unlike the wind certificates that are being bought for the electricity under the CCA, which can come from like Madison County but have no way of getting down here. These are areas that are like solar farms in Orange County, Ulster County, that are in our grid and contribute to our grid. So on the CDG model, you basically buy a subscription. It's for people that don't have their own solar on their house, although there are ways for them to participate. And this was designed so that we could support the financing for more of these projects to be quickly developed. And in doing that, you're supporting both local solar and you get about a 10% discount off whatever variable rate that you're paying for Central Hudson or whatever fixed rate you're paying from your ESCO. So these credits go on top of those other two programs. So if your bill is $100, you get credit for, you end up paying only $90 for that. And what we proposed to the council at that time is that the state was considering, like the CCA, this opt-out model, where we basically put everybody in the pool, and if they don't want to be in the pool, they opt out. And we were looking to do that for CDG, so that these solar credits would go on, and no matter what, we're not betting on a price. We're not saying we think the price is going to be $10 and then you win if it goes above 10 or you lose if it goes below 10. Basically, we're saying whatever that variable price is, you save 10%. That is not available yet from the state. I've talked to Juul about it. I've talked to Sustainable Westchester, which is like the nonprofit Juul down in Westchester. When the state does approve that, I would like to move forward and propose to you to go into the CDG program. In the meantime, I'm trying to do other things that move the ball forward, so I want to let you know those as well. We've had conversations with Sustainable Westchester, which is now working outside of their catchment county, and we've been helping to put them together with housing developers like Tompkins Terrace so that they can put community solar over their meter and save the 10% and also then support, in this case, a solar installation up in Ulster County. We're also working now to fast track and move along this year the 174 kilowatt solar installation that we want to put on the highway garage. And we just last week got a signed contract from the state for grant money in that covers about 30% of it. We're also talking to Jewel about coming on as a consultant to help us get some of the tax credits that are available through the Inflation Reduction Act. Tax credits usually are not relevant to municipalities, but in this case, they're reimbursable tax credits. So they basically are a grant. So we're playing that out as well. And again, I think in the future, we're open to the model of a CCA if we can see our way through this being fixed. I'd like to see how the litigation ends. I'd like to see how it works out from a price point. I'd also like to see if we could do the CDG instead of that, because if your goals are two things on this. One is fostering greater development of renewable energy in this grid area. The CDG does that. The CCA doesn't. It does support renewables, but a lot of those renewables are in areas that don't have transmission capacity to our ISO zone, our grid zone. The other thing is to save money. With the CCA, if you bet wrong, you actually are going to cost your residents more money. With the CDG, whatever the variable rate is, they save 10%. So that's why we had suggested that we not go into the CCA, that we look to do the CDG. I want to remind you that when this came up, we had a month. We were in the middle of our budget. I was trying to get the firehouse design finished. And again, the thought of having to explain this to angry consumers again was not something I was ready to do because Jewel wanted to do it at that time. So again, we've kept a good relationship with Jewel. We've supported their lawsuit. Nick did a lot of work for them that added value to what they're doing because we thought it was important. But I do need to let you know it cost us dozens of hours of our legal time, a lot of staff time, a lot of angry calls. I will say, to be balanced, that our consumers did save about $671,000 over that last contract. So when people say that what Beacon did cost us money, that's not true. It actually saved the residents of Beacon $671,000, because in that case, the bet worked. So again, I know that's longer than probably anybody wanted to hear, but if I can memorize all that, then you can listen to it.
Impressed.
And Faye, if I made any mistakes, just go at it. And that was the short version. All right.
So yeah, the one thing that, of all of that stuck with me was what was I willing to do for everyone in the community? And a bet, and it could go either way, remember, because you're taking a variable rate and you're betting on a fixed number. It's hard to imagine that everyone in the community is in the financial position to tolerate a loss in that situation. Whereas the other model that says, oh, whatever your bill is or whatever the variable rate is, we're not going to alter that. We're just going to give you 10% reduction. Everyone can afford that. And so it was kind of hard, we were looking at this, and that was the part we couldn't get to, which is I don't think we're in the position of saying that we have the vision or the foresight to invest for the entire community here. And especially where rates were at the time, I think there was a significant risk that that would go in the wrong direction anyway. So I'm not a betting person for the community. So I just wanted to let you know that.
And one of the things we might do in the interim is work with Jewel and/or Sustainable Westchester to set up a ready-made program, so if people do want to participate, they don't have to go and research all of this. We've already done it. They can easily participate. I know that the Beacon Housing Authority now has done a contract for community solar that's going to bring their utilities down 10%. So again, I think there are other ways the goal is correct here. It did work out, except that the contract ended up being defaulted on, and it was a mess. There's some value here, and I would like to try to parse out that value without throwing away the whole discussion of how we continue to green the grid, because that is going to be vital.
Thank you for, that was a great short version. I hope people listen to it and then listen to it again to remember all those details, and I hope that I have been communicating to constituents what you described adequately in this interim period that we've been in. And I think the last thing you said ties into the question that I had gotten, which is it would be great for individual constituents to, in the meantime, know what their opt-in options are as individuals. I pointed this person to, there's a whole world of sort of opt-in models out there, and I don't know if it's necessarily worth the city's time to create recommendations, but it sounded like a little bit what you were sort of getting at as a good next step. While we wait in the meantime for this CDG option, which I continue to agree is a good step.
I think that's doable, and I think we can work with either Jewel or Sustainable Westchester to ask them to help us set up a program that's opt-in. How that exactly works will need to be worked out. We have to find some way in which they are compensated for their time. Sure. So again, I think we can do that. I know people have asked me in the past to do this. They're like, I don't even know, because they hear about Next Camp, and then there's companies that go door to door, and I'm in something called Green Power, Green Street Power, where I live, and it's really hard to decipher unless you take the time. And what I do want to do is just make it easy for people to sign up so that they can give somebody, their utility bill, and they can walk them through. I am still concerned about the billing issues. The billing issues, I would slow walk this a little bit, because there's no way these billing issues have been fully resolved. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I don't even know when I get a bill anymore. I get 2 bills 1 month, and then go 3 months, and then I get these credits, and I've given up even trying to track it. Like, I just track it at the end of the year, and I'm like, that's close. So, yeah.
That's short version.
You want the long version?
No.
Okay.
No. Everybody good? Yep. All right. Thank you. And then the last item is a resolution regarding the discharge of contaminated water at Indian Point.
And we have our Climate Smart Coordinator, Faye Leone, to talk to the council about the resolution, which she helped us with.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Hi. Thanks for having me. Okay, so the resolution that we put together for you would do 2 things. First, it would express opposition to Holtec's release of contaminated water into the Hudson River. And secondly, it would express support for a state ban that's been proposed by an assembly member and a state senator that would ban any radiological agent being released into New York waters at all. So I'll give some context for where this draft resolution is coming from, what happened. So Indian Point is a nuclear power plant in a village called Buchanan, which is down near Peekskill. The plant stopped operating in 2021. And at that point, a company called Holtec took ownership of the plant and is responsible for the decommissioning process. They have oversight from a multi-stakeholder group called the Decommissioning Oversight Board. And if you're interested in additional points of reference for Holtec's practices, the same company has other decommissioning projects in process right now. There's one at a plant in Massachusetts called Pilgrim Nuclear, and one in New Jersey called Oyster Bay. So coming back to Indian Point, what happened recently is that in February this year, Holtec informed the Decommissioning Oversight Board of its plans for how to deal with the radioactive wastewater that the plant had been generating during its operation. And from among all the options available for handling that contaminated water, Holtec announced that it was going to discharge that water into the Hudson River. They said this was the best way to complete the project on its planned timeframe and within its budget. The water would be filtered using available technologies, but that doesn't remove one particular element of concern. It's called tritium. It's linked to cancer, particularly in girls. So communities have been organizing to oppose this plan because of the danger that the tritium release would pose to human health and the environment. So along with Beacon's resolution, there are other communities in a wider effort that's being coordinated by Riverkeeper, Clearwater, the Sierra Club, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and others who are trying to stop the release of this water. And I mentioned the state bill, the second to last clause in the resolution is where that appears, and that bill is expected to get some discussion once the state budget passes, so sometime in the coming month perhaps, and it would need to kind of move quickly, so this is a very timely resolution for Beacon to consider. And that would amend the state's environmental conservation law to prohibit the discharge of any radiological agent into the waters of the state. So that's what I wanted to share as lay of the land on this draft resolution for you, but let me know if there are any questions.
I'm good.
I'm curious if there's any insight as to whether or not, once the bills do get discussed, if they're likely to pass, or if this, just the kind of the benefit of us passing a resolution in support of that, if that could make a difference to it actually being taken more seriously at the state level.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think that there is some question of what the state's level of power is in this situation vis-a-vis the federal agency that regulates nuclear projects, the NRC. So it's just an effort to build as much leverage as possible and as many voices as possible.
Yeah, I think the preemption issue at the federal level is the piece that the state can't figure out how to get around, may not be able to get around, right? Because I think these discharges, I think everything about nuke plants have been NRC controlled issues, right? So
Right.
I assume the legislation is looking at how to get around that, or what areas there might be room for maneuver. Yeah.
Anything else? There are good scientists who have been sort of advising the community groups working on this, so if there's any technical or scientific questions, we can probably get some more information.
Everybody good? All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's all we got. So,
I have a 2-minute update of the post office, because
Oh, sure.
I know all of you, your emails are blowing up. So you may know about a week to 2 weeks ago, word spread in Beacon that we were going to lose the carriers, and that was a preface to closing down the post office. When we got word of that, we did reach out to Congressman Pat Ryan's office in Kingston. They were doing a call today with their Washington office to ascertain what the details on it. I did reach out to both the postmaster, who is currently on a different assignment. The Beacon postmaster is over in Hopewell, and I spoke to the interim postmaster. Neither of them believes that closure is at all considered. They thought that was highly unlikely. It had not been discussed. What is being discussed is doing these S&D centers, the sorting and delivery. So the carriers that now report for the 13 routes that are done in the 12508 area would instead report to Newburgh. There were 15 or 16 communities that were going to be moved over there. It included Fishkill, New Paltz was on the list, Rock Tavern, a number of other areas. And when I talked to the postmaster, she said basically all of the retail functions of the post office are going to remain the same. And in fact, there was a similar kind of consolidation of the sorting and delivery in Eastern Dutchess some years ago that Hopewell was part of, and they still remain open. So I have other calls. We're waiting for a final call back from Congressman Ryan's office. I also did speak, I left messages with the Vice President of the American Postal Workers Union, who I worked with years ago, fighting other closures in Sullivan County. But it doesn't seem like there's any real threat to close the post office. It would change where the carriers report, but the function day-to-day, your delivery, your ability to go to the post office, to have a box, to purchase postage and other items there, would not change.
So none of the customer-facing elements are involved in any consideration for change?
That's correct. And when I said, well, do you think this could be a step towards closing? They said, no, this is one of our busiest post offices. So again, if somebody was going to close post offices, this would not be top of the list to close. And again, when we fought this years ago, when I was in a congressional office, we were closing very, very small post offices in towns that you wouldn't even recognize the name of, where they only had a few people going in and a few boxes left. And even there, we were able to stop it. So that's my update.
Okay. On that, do I need a motion to adjourn? I need a motion to adjourn.
Motion.
Molly?
Second?
Paloma, all in favor? Have a good evening, everyone.
Recordings.